Welcome to the State of Cyber War, a production of the CyAN Secure in Mind series of podcasts. Join us as we discuss international cybersecurity policy, information warfare, cyber defense, and how they affect the digital security of the world around us. Hi again, and welcome to episode 2 of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, or CyAN's State of Cyber War podcast and video conversation series. Today I'm here again with James Briscoe, our Secretary General. My name is John Salomon, and we're going to talk about, we're going to have a shorter one today than our first kickoff episode, and we're going to talk about Japan. So, James, you did a lot of work on Japan and Japanese geopolitical activities, defense activities. And you actually lived there for a while. I think you even speak Japanese, right? So,
I do, yeah.
For an Australian living in Finland, that's a pretty normal combination. I failed 3 times in high school. So let's get cracking. Japan obviously is a major part of the I'm going to quote unquote Western aligned Pacific security overall alliance. Very, very close U.S. ally since the end of World War II. And not necessarily a country where, especially in Europe and North America, you hear a lot about its cybersecurity posture. You want to kick off with a few initial thoughts on where they stand and where they're coming from, and maybe a couple of the major threats they're facing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really could go on for hours about that, to be perfectly honest. I can start all the way back in time immemorial, but it's really, I think, the simplest and the most prudent considerations here are the fact that up until very recently, as a matter of fact, December 2022, the Japanese cybersecurity strategy was very much on the passive side, and it really relied on the traditional agreements set out by the US and Japan Joint Security Treaty, which was first signed in 1960. And so this really set the tone for a lot of things for decades, from alongside the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which was implemented by the SCAP, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, at the end of World War II, which forbids any holding of war potential by the Japanese government in the state, which they do have a self-defense force to this day because it's legal under international laws, but the defense is far more strict than it is in other defense forces. And so until recently, very recently, where Japan finds itself suddenly in the center of one of the most tense and unique security environments on the planet, it really didn't have the ability to even create a information warfare posture or conduct active cyber defense for itself. So this is something that we've seen change as of December last year, and something that was very much driven by the invasion of Ukraine.
Well, that's a good lead in up. I mean, Japan faces a whole range of when you think about it more closely, faces a whole range of threats in the cyber arena. Now, obviously the Japanese military, especially under former Prime Minister Abe, started taking a much more muscular stance with regards to at least conventional quote unquote defense. The Japanese self-defense forces are not formally a military. And given the fact that they have in their immediate neighborhood a couple of pretty nasty neighbors when it comes to international cyber war, cyber offensive capabilities, North Korea, China to some degree, or to a large degree actually, Russia. These are all countries they've got a certain amount of political and geopolitical beef with, potentially even military beef with. And as you say, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I think it became much more clear that they're facing, despite being a heavily neutral country in most ways, are facing an increasingly hostile environment and potential threats from a lot of angles. So it makes sense. For example, you mentioned the 2019 the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which treats a cyber attack as an armed attack, essentially, or could constitute an armed attack. How broad does that go? Because this reflects similar moves by the U.S. and its allies in other parts of the world. For example, with NATO and invocation of Article 5. Where does this leave Japan in case of a quote unquote cyber attack? Does this defend a cyber attack? Because that's open to a lot of interpretation.
Yeah, and the interpretation is really the crux of the matter there. I think similar to Article 5, this agreement and this revision that a large enough cyber attack on either the US or Japan constitutes an armed attack and would activate the US-Japan Security Treaty. These sorts of agreements are usually intentionally vague to perform really two duties at the same time: to allow, in the event of a severe attack, action to be taken due on the nation's discretion, but it also allows for off-ramps so that there's no military action locked in under certain scenarios, so that there are pathways to de-escalation. And that, in particular, is usually the JSDF, the Japanese government's preference to really de-escalate and let the United States handle the majority and the brunt of its operations through their bases on Japan. But I think that's a stance we will continue to see change over the coming years, because the provisions of the national security strategy at the end of 2022 really signal from the Japanese government that they are willing to take on some of the issues in the region that experts and allies have been calling on them to do so for decades.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's especially when you're confronted with potential opponents like the DPRK, North Korea, that engage in extremely aggressive, hyper aggressive chest thumping and bluster. That if you didn't have the as you put it, off ramps that could lead to de-escalation, and treat them essentially like a spoiled child having a tantrum, then you might get locked into a course of action that could potentially even lead to nuclear escalation at some point. So especially with somebody in the immediate vicinity, read missile range, that makes a lot of sense. And now we've seen, for example, with regards to North Korea, the U.S., Japan, and the ROK, South Korea, recently announced that they would, I think it was December 9th, they announced that they would increase their cooperation in terms of countering North Korean threats. North Korea famously, not only Lazarus groups, but other actors engaging in narcotics trafficking, money laundering, outright thefts, at the same time, for financial gain for the country, at the same time as seeking to undermine their opponents', political, economic, and to some degree cyber stability. It's kind of an interesting attitude given the tensions that Japan has had in the past with South Korea. What do you think about the potential for cooperation in cyberspace in that regard? Do you think that is a good avenue for them to build bridges going forward to kind of augment each other's capabilities? Is the U.S. the linchpin of all this, or do you think there's going to be more bilateral cooperation in terms of bolstering their defenses?
Yeah, that's a really big question. You've kind of struck upon a ever ongoing debate within the Japan and South Korea watchers, particularly in terms of military. But I think it's definitely worth considering. The animosity between Japan and South Korea flares up every now and again, usually with changes in governments, particularly governments wanting to boost their own support. And so we see that the US has the opportunity to really bring them both to the table here and enact some form of cooperation on a higher level. How meaningful this is usually down to the amounts that the US makes in cooperation cooperates and is willing to cooperate themselves in these information sharing agreements. And I think that the growing threat of North Korea, as its capabilities get more advanced, particularly they're extremely successful, particularly their groups, their ATP groups like Lazarus are extremely successful and extremely aggressive, and they're garnering massive amounts of
extremely profitable when it comes to activities like I think cryptocurrency theft is a relatively new angle compared to their other activities, but very lucrative.
Yeah, absolutely, they're extraordinarily profitable, and this money can be reasonably assumed to be going towards really weapons research and funding other projects that really can only lead to destabilization of the region. And so I think these sorts of agreements are the way forward, and it's just a matter of time to see how much information will realistically be shared.
And I mean, it's interesting because this comes on the heels of in 2020, at the end of 22, there were a couple of articles that Japan intends to move towards, quote unquote. I have one here from a site called Dragonfly Intelligence, a more offensive cyber posture in 23, and followed up a report from Nikkei in January that they're going to quadruple their quote unquote cyber defense forces. Given Article 9, given the discussions with the U.S. and other allies, not only around defending against North Korea, do you think that there's a potential for the Japanese, along with other allies, to start offensive operations, whatever that means?
I think other allies is definitely a different matter, but for the Japanese, this new regulation, at least not regulation, but reinterpretation of their legal capabilities and provision, really won't see them enacting offensive operations of their own volition, but rather in response, or at least to countermand. It's a different domain, but it's a logical follow-on from, I believe, a 2016 revision of collective self-defense of Japan, which allowed for the JSDF to even go overseas and fight in foreign wars if the threat was a credible threat to Japan and the Japanese people. So this new interpretation of the law definitely follows in the same footsteps there. So I think if there's a credible and provable threat, they will still move slower than their counterparts, but they will definitely be able to take more action and cooperate to a greater extent than they have.
That makes a lot of sense. And you also mentioned not only when we're preparing for this, that there's planned increase of up to 2% of GDP spending by 27 from currently more or less 1%, something our American friends are probably
very happy about.
Yeah, very happy.
They've been clamoring for this for decades. Yeah,
it's still not up to what is the NATO level? I think it's 3.5%, something like that.
I think so.
But still, I mean, it's quite a step, especially given the massive planned uptake in national cyber defense personnel spending and training as well. And what I find extremely interesting here is the alliances and increased cooperation agreements, not only in the Asia Pacific region, which also makes sense given tensions around the South China Sea and potentially Taiwan. But also, both of us have seen various aspects of Japan's engagement with NATO in the CCDCOE in Tallinn, the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, and various exercises, not least of which are locked shields. Right. So I wonder whether this is part of an overall shift of more global interactivity and cooperation of powers which previously have been mostly regionally focused. Where do you see the Japanese engaging, with counterparts globally? What can they learn from, for example, dealing with the Europeans in things like exercises and information sharing?
A lot, to be quite frank. The current state of Japan's cybersecurity forces, for lack of a better word, I'll take the words of, I can't remember which US official, but it might be Blinken, is that they are in the minor leagues. They are not up to the standard of their allies and their counterparts. And this revision of the national security strategy explicitly aims to really bring them either on par or surpassing nations of similar size. And so it's a really ambitious target, one that will see immense amounts of people trained or retrained. I think, from memory, there's training planned for over the course of the next 5 years for about 4,000 quote unquote cyber warriors, and then also 16,000 self-defense personnel to be retrained and specialized, which out of a total force of about 280,000 active members is a significant investment. And so they have a lot to learn, and also a lot to change in terms of a cultural aspect. There's been a lot of complacency around cybersecurity up until now. Even the attacks on the big ransomware attack on Nagoya port earlier in the year was mainly a issue of complacency.
It's interesting because, there was a massive issue, I believe it was last, no, actually it just came out in August, that in 2020, Chinese groups had infiltrated and penetrated a significant proportion of, I'm looking for the term here, quote, most sensitive computer systems from, according to Washington Post. And at the same time, if you look at, Russian-aligned KillNet group, they actually ceased operations in September of 2022 because of lack of funds. So there seems to be a very, very strong dichotomy between, while Japan sees Russia as a threat, and it is obviously a threat, and there are tensions over things like, Sakhalin and generally Russia.
Kuril Island, yeah.
Yeah, Kuril Islands, exactly. The Chinese are the big issues. Do you just kind of wrapping up, do you see the Japanese getting involved in potentially getting involved in tensions over, let's say, Taiwan or South China Sea, kind of the geopolitical flashpoints, which are, I think, most often associated with potential military action, but I'm not really sure on the online dimension of this, the information warfare dimension of this.
Yeah, that's very hard to say at the moment. I think involvement will be a very tricky affair. It's been a long time coming, but popular support for the JSDF and the military revisions has always been quite low. The JSDF has only ever been able to increase its support publicly after natural disasters. And that's the reason why a lot of people usually volunteer in the first place, because they have positive experiences post-natural disaster. But it's only recently, in the last few years, that we've seen a more general anxiety around the region, and particularly emerging. And so whether or not Japan will be actively involved, whether it can trigger collective self-defense articles, remains to be seen. Whether it's a credible threat to the islands of Japan and the Japanese people, or whether or not Japan will function as it did in the Korean War as a staging for US forces. I think in either case, cybersecurity operations and will inevitably make a part of Japanese involvement. I find it highly unlikely as a US ally that if God forbid, tensions were to flare up and war was actually to start, I find it highly unlikely that as a close American ally, that the Japanese mainland would be spared cyber attacks. And so I think this would allow for, at least under the new and continuing revisions for the Japanese government, which will also, as part of these revisions for the national security strategy, be revising the telecommunications laws and the unauthorized computer access prohibition law to allow itself to conduct administrative and legal interception of foreign,
And I mean,
foreign interference. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that was it. Yeah.
Sorry, given that the Chinese, I would assume, are a rational actor. I mean, North Korea is going to North Korea, no matter what. You know, they are. You know, I'd say they're almost in a self-destructive course if again it weren't so lucrative and successful. This both saber rattling and you know, for profit fishing excursions that they embark on. But with the Chinese, I would naturally assume that, especially given that their focus seems to be on you know, places like the Spratlys and Taiwan, with President Xi recently having reiterated to Biden at their summit that the stated position that they would eventually absorb Taiwan. One would assume that the Chinese would not want a distraction in the form of Japanese, whether physical, as you put it previously, kinetic forces, or cyber attacks, you know, on their flanks, as it were, right? So do you think maybe that the Japanese are probably reasonably safe from you know, the fallout of any major conflict, or do you think they would just be pulled in by virtue of their alliances if that were to come to pass?
I think it would be somewhere in the middle. These alliances would pull Japan in, but Japan has been extremely reluctant to act in the past, and usually only assists in terms of sending money, as they were very publicly lambasted for doing post-invasion of Ukraine, or just running shipments. They were occasionally in peace-keeping operations during the War on Terror. They would occasionally send squads, but I think there is a possibility, but I think that even with the rise in acceptance of the military and an increased security posture, it would be very hard to see them willingly jump into it.
All right. I think on that's a good point to wrap up on. Let's hope so. Let's hope that.
Yeah, there's so much to go for that we could definitely do a follow-up, I think.
Well, I hope for everybody watching and listening, I hope you'll join us for future episodes. As mentioned in our first one, we hope to do these on a semi-weekly-ish cadence with obvious breaks for the holidays now. With that, thanks again for joining. Look forward to seeing you next year. Probably we'll be doing another one on disinformation. We recently did one for the main CyAN network with a Ukrainian colleague, Dmitry Bilash. Do check that out. I'll link to it in the comments. The description rather. Want to wish you, James, and everybody who's listening, all our CyAN members, all our stakeholders, all our friends around the world, a very, very happy, peaceful holidays, a successful and quiet new year. And don't forget to check us out on cybersecurityadvisors.network. Like, share, subscribe, the usual drill. And thanks again for joining, and talk to you soon.
Likewise. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.